Welcome back, everyone. This is Dalen with another random making encounter, and this one is by request. A couple of requests. You know who you are. How I make barbed wire in various shapes and sizes. All right, so let's get into it. For this project, since we're using wire, we're going to need some sort of wire cutters. Anything really will do as long as it'll cut the wire gauge that you're using. Pliers to hold things, and you'll see why in a bit, but I really do like these smooth-faced or these sort of smooth-jawed pliers so that they don't damage the wire as I'm twisting like these would. You'll see why these are important in a bit, but I do like the smooth, and then I also like these sort of flat, wide ones so that I can wrap the wire over them. More to come on that. Some sort of tin snips or sacrificial scissors to trim everything when we're done. A little bit of liquid CA or super glue, the thin stuff, not gel. If you're like me and you tend to glue your fingers to things, it's always good to have something to remove super glue so you can unstick your fingers from things, or just wear gloves. That's always actually very wise thing to do. Since this is a barbed wire project, we're going to need wire of some sort, and there's a bunch of different stuff you can use, but what I've got here is some jewelry wire, some beading wire, and some varieties of thicknesses, some gauges. So we've got 20 gauge, 24 gauge, and 28 gauge, and then this is some 30 gauge floral wire, uncoated floral wire. And so it doesn't really have to be jewelry wire. It can be really kind of anything. This is normally green, and you'll find it over in the floral department in most craft stores. The weird thing about wire is that the smaller the number, the thicker the wire. So I'm not really sure why that is the way it is, but 30 gauge that we're using here is the smallest wire that I've got. For this project, we'll use something a little bit heavier, but it's really up to you, and it will depend on your scale what gauge you want to use for your wire. The first step is to create the central or the main strand of barbed wire. Now, you would select the right gauge based on the scale that you're going for. And in this case, I'm going to use some 24 gauge. It's not the heaviest wire I have. It's definitely not the lightest, but it's kind of a good workable one for this project, for this demo. I'm going to double it over. So I've got two strands side by side, basically at the length that I want them to be for my finished piece roughly. A little bit longer is better, but you don't want to have a piece that is too long. The longer the piece, the more challenging it is to kind of just wrestle with it, to wrangle the wire as you're wrapping the barbs. So start with sort of reasonable and manageable pieces. What we want to do is we want to twist this. If you look at real barbed wire, that central core has a bit of a twist to it to hold it all together, and you could do it by hand. But if you are lazy like I am, or you have a particularly long strand, you can take a little drill and you can just sort of speed that process up a little bit. We don't want to over twist this. We want to have it just have a little bit of texture and enough that it's kind of twisted together nicely. And to do this, I just took a little screw eye and bent that open and chucked it in a drill, and there we go. Now, once it is twisted, you can see it's a lot straighter too, so twisting helps kind of keep it straight and get all the curve out of it from being on the spool. It also gives us a little bit of texture so that when we paint it, it's not just sort of boring and a single strand of wire. I'm going to grab a piece of the same gauge, roughly the same size, a little bit bigger. It doesn't matter, we can always add on to the barbs as we go along. And I'm just going to start by taking it and I'm going to feed it through the little eyelet that I created. This is just a quick tip to sort of start it on the end so that it grabs as I start to wrap it around. and I'm going to give it 3 or 4 twists around the main core. Then using the flat pliers, I'm going to wrap them, and I'm going to give it 3 more wraps, 3 or 4, doesn't really matter. And I'm going to, if I'm over the top, I'm going to have it end with the wire pointing down. I'm going to take the pliers, move them down to the other side of my wraps, and I'm going to come up and I'm going to wrap them up against the pliers nice and tight, give it another 3 or 4 wraps, and finish now. Since I'm going across the bottom, I'm going to finish with the wire facing up. You should kind of get a sense of where we're headed with this. I'm just going to tuck it in, going to wrap it, and again finish down because we're on the upside. Move over, come over, and just rinse and repeat. You can see if the wire's too long, and it can be kind of fussy, and so that's why working with short pieces of wire where it's easier to kind of get your hands around it, and you're not just kind of having all this long wire whipping around is a lot easier. If we take a quick close look, you can see how these are alternating up and down, and you can already see where the barbs are going to form. I'm just going to continue on here, making sure to tuck everything in nice and snug so that those barb wraps are nice and even. If you go 3, 4, 5, 6 is probably too much. Don't ever do 6. I'm kidding. Do whatever you want. But really, 3 or 4 wraps is probably pretty similar or scale. Now you can see here, if I run out of wire, I can just snip it close. And I'm going to just grab another hunk of wire, and I will snip that to length, and I'll just kind of add onto it. I'll just do a couple quick wraps, little 3 wrap here, and then once that first one is started, I'll go back to grabbing with the pliers and just sort of move on as before. This is actually pretty quick and easy, but you can see if you work with smaller pieces, you have less that you're actually having to move all the way around the main core, and especially if you've got a really long core wire that you're trying to work with, kind of wrangling it around can be really challenging. And so small short pieces makes it a lot easier, and this is really pretty fast. You want to just work with whatever's the most efficient length for you. Unless you're really trying to do something that's, trench, no man's land, World War I, coils of barbed wire, this goes pretty quickly, and it's kind of relaxing, and, put something on, some good tunes, and just go to town and make your barbed wire. We're going to call it a day here, and we're just going to snip that last one. Now, once this is all made to the length, we're going to need to fix those barbs in place. If we were to snip our barbs right now, everything would slide around and it would not be very good, because things would just start moving because nothing's really holding it to the wire. So this is just some thin super glue, some CA glue, and I'm just going to dab it basically along each of those points where there's a barb. We don't want it to be too blobby because it'll fill the wire, so we don't want to use thick, we want to use thin set, and we just want it to penetrate into each of those little barbed points. To speed everything up, I'm going to just give it a little shake there so it doesn't have any extra. I'm going to use some accelerator and just zap it with that so that it is nice and fast and quick cure. Quick cure is a relative thing. I've definitely glued my fingers to the wire even after hitting it with the accelerator. At this point, I'm gonna go in and start to trim all of the barbs. Now, snipping them one at a time like this is really tedious and takes a little bit more time. So an easier way is to go back to those tin snips or those shears, or even just some sacrificial scissors. Don't use your good ones, but something that you can just kind of snip a couple at a time and just work your way down. This goes a lot faster when you're snipping the actual barbs. You don't want to cut them too close at this point, but try and get them, kind of as close as you can. And again, this is not, 6 decimal places of accuracy. We just want them to be noticeable, but not overly long. And then we can always come back and sort of trim them up and tidy them up later. At this point, it's done, except for some painting and weathering, but I can go back, and if there's some long ones, I can come in and I can just do a little bit of pruning, a little tidying up. If the barbs are bent in a sort of unappealing way, or everything starts to look the same direction, I can tweak those a little bit, trim off the extra junky ends, just to clean everything up. And voila, that is our scale barbed wire. You can see it looks like real barbed wire because basically, for all intents and purposes, it is barbed wire. Now for thicker wire, you're going to want to increase the space between the barbs. So really, to do that, all you need to do is double it or sort of slide it down and just eyeball it to a point where it makes sense with the scale. Another cool thing you can do is if you really twist that wire super tight, it starts to actually turn it into kind of more like a solid bar of something, and it's just more for texture. And that can look a lot like rebar. So if you painted this up, gave it a nice sort of a rebar color and some rust, embed this in some concrete, twist it up for battle damage, it can look pretty cool. Now, as far as scale goes, here we've got our little Space Marine for scale. There is this mystery wire in there, but I think this is our heaviest at 20 gauge. I think the next one is some 24 gauge beading wire. This next one I think is the mystery wire. I think this is some 26 gauge stainless wire. I do not recommend stainless. It's pretty hard to work with. And then some 28 and 30, much softer wires to work with. If we think about it from a scale perspective, this is probably a little heavy if you think about how big a Space Marine is. We're starting to get better at the 28, and 30 is probably kind of the best. But it's really up to you with what you're trying to accomplish and what you have handy. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, check me out on Instagram, follow me on all of those social media platforms, all that good stuff, and we will see you back again really soon with another random making encounter.